Good morning, everyone. We've got another minute left to the hour here, but we are expecting a large attendance, so we'll give folks about a minute here before we get started. Okay, well, I think we could get started. Welcome and good morning all. I'm Corinne DiDomenico, Assistant Director for NYSERDA's Large Scale Renewables team. Thank you so much for joining us for this technical conference on the white paper on Clean Energy Standard Procurement to implement New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which you'll hear referred to quite a bit as the CLCPA. Today's agenda will include opening remarks from John Rhodes, the Chair of the Public Service Commission and Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Public Service, and Doreen Harris, NYSERDA's Acting President and CEO. After John and Doreen's opening remarks, we will then move on to the presentation on the white paper. Once we finish the presentation, there will be a Q&A session. First, we will respond to questions that were submitted by stakeholders in advance, and then we'll move on to questions submitted during today's event. A few housekeeping items before I hand this over to John and Doreen. All participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We ask that you use the Q&A feature during the event as an opportunity to ask questions. Please feel free to do so throughout the webinar. We'll make every effort to reserve time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. This event will be recorded and the slides will be made available. With that, we'll get started, and I'm pleased to introduce John Rhodes.
Hi, thank you, Corinne, and good morning to all of you. I'm John Rhodes, head of New York State's Department of Public Service, and I'm very pleased to welcome you. Can I just check that the sound is good? Can folks hear me?
We hear you loud and clear, John.
Excellent. So my welcome still stands, and thank you for joining us at this technical conference and for participating in the process to expand and accelerate New York's clean energy standard. Your comments, your questions, your suggestions will help the Commission to arrive at the best possible update of this clean energy standard and help the state take the best possible approach to procuring the clean energy that our state requires, an approach that needs to be reliable, just, cost-effective, and sure. A few weeks ago, on June 15th, NYSERDA and DPS issued an expanded Clean Energy Standard white paper. This lays out a proposed framework for implementing the CLCPA, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act directive, that the New York State Public Service Commission, PSC, established a program for the procurement of large-scale renewable energy resources, such as land-based wind and solar and offshore wind, to meet the state's goals of securing 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, on the way to 100% carbon-free energy by 2040, and advance equity and environmental justice for communities and workers, and to ensure that they adequately participate in and benefit from our state's clean energy transition. Today's technical conference provides you, as stakeholders, with a detailed overview of the white paper contents and proposals, and the opportunity to ask DPS and NYSERDA questions about the white paper, and for the team to provide responses. We have received some questions in advance, thank you, and we'll be replying to those specifically, as well as to questions that come in through the chat function. Our aim is also to provide you, coming out of here, with the information that you need to provide the most helpful official comments on the proposed framework. Receiving those comments and having as much engagement and input from you is critical to our process, the integrity of that process, and to the quality that we want to achieve. So in asking for comments, we've established a couple of windows. One I've already mentioned, that ahead of this technical conference, we asked for and received one set of comments. We also asked for an initial tranche of brief informal comments by July 24 in about 10 days. And then formal comments are due no later than August 31 of this year. And after this, the Public Service Commission will deliberate and make its final determination on how best to direct the achievement of the approaches that are set forth in this white paper. So thank you for joining this morning, and thank you ahead of time for the spirit of input and collaboration and the quality of your comments that you will bring to the process. And it's now my pleasure to briefly introduce Doreen Harris. She's known to all of you, and literally, truly, this is not a cliche, needs no introduction. She has for years now been a key architect and leader of the state's large-scale renewables policy, and as Corinne mentioned, she's now serving as president and CEO of NYSERDA. Doreen, over to you.
Well, thank you to the chair. I appreciate the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Doreen Harris, the acting president and CEO of NYSERDA. I thank you all for joining us today. It's an exciting time here in New York as we look to implement the Clean Energy Standard through the framework of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And so today we're going to be going into a good bit of detail on the white paper that the NYSERDA and DPS team filed recently. And so I'll just give you a bit of an overview of what you can expect. The white paper, as described by the chair, it specifically looks to implement key provisions contained within the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, specifically associated with an objective to achieve the 70% renewable energy by 2030 goal. Within that objective, the paper speaks to questions of resource eligibility from a renewable perspective, and also the amounts needed to meet this goal. How we get from here to there is certainly a focus of the paper. And in doing so, it proposes procurement targets annually for both land-based and offshore renewables, specifically talking about changes to the procurement process for the land-based renewable program, but also laying out a path to achieve the CLCPA target of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035 as well. As is typical for these papers in our analysis, the NYSERDA team with DPS has conducted an analysis of the costs and benefits of these procurements, and we'll be sharing that assessment with you today as well. And then with regard to policy proposals, there is the proposal to create a new Tier 4 renewable program under the Clean Energy Standard, which is designed and proposed to value specifically the environmental attributes associated with renewables delivered into New York City's Zone J. In addition, there is a proposal within the white paper to expand Tier 1 eligibility to those facilities which repower from a renewable perspective. And finally, the paper does take up the question, a limited question around the Tier 2 program, which NYSERDA had proposed earlier this year through a petition. The paper asks specific questions around whether NYPA's hydroelectric resources should be eligible as a self-supply option for NYPA under that program. So that's the scope of the paper and something our team will be reviewing in detail. From a general perspective, though, I know I speak for the chair and for NYSERDA in saying that we see clean energy as a very important tool to spur the economic recovery that New York seeks. Although more recently, the clean energy industry has experienced job losses related to the COVID pandemic, we're very excited about the opportunity to use clean energy as a tool to jumpstart our economy and to move forward. And indeed, prior to this year, our 2019 Clean Energy Industry Report reported almost 160,000 clean energy jobs across the state. The clean energy industry at that point had grown at a rate more than double the growth of the state's overall economy. And we see the implementation of the Clean Energy Standard as an important tool to continue that growth. We believe this paper sends a strong signal to the market that we are serious about achieving our goals, and we expect that that certainty will drive new private investment into our state and into the entire supply chain. In addition, though, it is important to note that the CLCPA establishes a very important framework whereby tangible approaches to ensure that our renewable programs bring benefits to disadvantaged communities, including low to moderate income customers, is on the forefront. And indeed, this paper speaks to that very important issue. It's important for us to know that the health consequences and the other consequences borne by these communities are actively addressed, and that public health benefits are realized through these programs. So the white paper looks carefully at the benefits that will come to New York from the perspective of economic, environmental, and health benefits as well. And you'll hear today that taking into account the value of avoided carbon emissions, the related offshore and land-based procurements are expected to deliver a combined $17.3 billion in net benefits over their life. And this doesn't speak to the additional benefits that we know these projects will provide from the perspective of health benefits in particular, from reducing related pollutants. In addition, it's important to note that the white paper does include important proposals to deliver clean and renewable energy into the two largest load pockets in the state, New York City and Long Island. These projects are expected to significantly improve local air quality and public health, which is particularly important in the New York City metropolitan area, where we see a significant density of these emissions sources. And it is the case that we have for many years and will continue to ensure and commit to the fact that these projects will bring benefits, economic benefits to New Yorkers from the perspective of wages and benefits. And in fact, in addition to the prevailing wage requirements that we've already incorporated and the project labor agreement considerations incorporated within our offshore wind procurements, NYSERDA, through this paper, has committed to explicitly incorporate community engagement and prioritization of these benefits to disadvantaged communities in its project selection process. So we're looking seriously at the commitment of these companies to consider and benefit disadvantaged communities carefully as they advance their projects. And we at NYSERDA will reward those projects that take seriously that commitment from the perspective of environmental, economic benefits, and job creation. So as noted, NYSERDA and DPS did include a series of questions in the notice that went out announcing today's technical conference. We have very specific questions that we would really want to focus your comments on, because these are very specific topics that we're talking about today. And as part of those questions, we're very interested to engage on this topic of disadvantaged communities to ensure that we're getting this right from the perspective of the commitments that we're making and the benefits that we would expect to accrue. So not only would we welcome your comments in general, but specifically on this topic, as we want to make sure that our work upholds the principles of environmental justice and incorporates strong consideration of the impacts to disadvantaged communities as well. So with this brief overview, we have the NYSERDA and DPS team ready to go into more detail around these various aspects of this white paper. But I thank you for joining us today, and I know the chair feels the same. You know, this engagement helps for better work products, and ultimately we're very excited to kick off this effort with the technical conference today. So thank you very much. Corinne?
Thank you, Doreen. And also just checking, can you guys hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, John and Doreen. We're going to dive right in now. So we should all, thank you, John. Here now I'm going to go through, actually myself, my colleague Eric Scherer at NYSERDA, as well as Matt Vestal will take you through the overview of the white paper, including obviously details on all the proposals contained therein, as well as the analysis. And here I'm going to talk about, again, briefly an overview of the white paper in alignment with the CLCPA. Next slide, please. The CLCPA requires the establishment of a renewable energy program as now codified in the Public Service Law. Section 66P of the PSL, Public Service Law, directs the Commission to establish a program where the jurisdictional load-serving entities have secured adequate amounts of renewable energy to serve at least 70% of load in 2030. And two, that there are zero emissions in 2040 associated with electrical demand. Beneath the sector-level goal, the CLCPA directs the establishment of programs for the procurement of specific technologies, including the 6 gigawatts of solar by 2025, 3 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030, and at least 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. NYSERDA and staff have developed a white paper to identify a proposed regulatory structure to address the CLCPA requirements for a renewable energy program. The white paper is being presented for public notice and comment, as John has mentioned, as well as the Commission's consideration. In sum, the white paper proposes to, one, use the existing regulatory and procurement structure established under the Commission's Clean Energy Standard program, otherwise known as CES, to meet the 70 by 30 target, and to set the state on a rapid and irreversible path to achieve the 2040 zero emission target. And two, adopt policy changes and other modifications as contained in the white paper to the CES in order to align with the CLCPA to meet this target. Next slide, please. So from a high level, the scope of the white paper will addresses key provisions in the CLCPA relating to the 70 by 30 target. It projects the quantity of renewable energy that must be deployed to achieve the 70 by 30 target, and includes the definition of the renewable energy system. It identifies the average annual procurement targets for the Tier 1 program and recommends changes to the Tier 1 procurement process. It proposes a procurement trajectory for offshore wind credits, otherwise known as ORECs, and intended to meet the 9 gigawatts by the 2035 requirement. It quantifies the estimated costs and benefits of these incremental Tier 1 and offshore wind procurements. It proposes the creation of the Tier 4 of the CES for the procurement of environmental attributes associated with the renewable energy deliveries into New York City, or the New York ISO Zone J. And it proposes a methodology for extending Tier 1 eligibility to renewable energy resources that undergo repowering. And it seeks comment on the competitive Tier 2 proposal that NYSERDA filed back on January 24th of this year. Next slide, please. So what you'll see here, which we'll get into more detail later, is that the estimated 2030 load is approximately 151,678 gigawatt hours. 30% of that, obviously, is assumed to be non-renewable to get to our 70% target. What we do have already currently generating in New York City is approximately 39,000 gigawatt hours. We have approximately 20,000 gigawatt hours under contract in New York State, which still needs to be constructed and it's under development. We'll also need an additional 47,000 gigawatt hours of additional contracted and constructed projects. This will include new land-based renewables, the remainder of offshore wind, and of course, as a part of all of this, distributed energy resources. Next slide, please. Resource eligibility. The white paper included a definition of renewable energy, which are systems that generate electricity or thermal energy through the use of the following technologies: solar thermal, PV, on land and offshore wind, hydroelectric, geothermal electric, geothermal ground source heat, tidal energy, wave energy, ocean thermal, and fuel cells which do not utilize a fossil fuel resource. The CLCPA does not explicitly include biomass or biogas, which are currently eligible under the Tier 1 and the Renewable Energy Standard. The CLCPA includes all hydroelectric resources as renewable resources. And of course, compliance tiers may apply constraints as we have in the past under Tier 1 and the like. Next slide, please. We then describe in the white paper the treatment of non-jurisdictional LSEs. Next slide, please. The CLCPA defines the term jurisdictional load serving entity, herein referred to as LSE, as any entity subject to the jurisdiction of the Commission that secures energy to serve the electrical energy requirements of end-use customers in New York State. The focus on jurisdictional LSEs means that the 2030 target is aimed at all entities serving retail load within a regulated utility territory. This includes our investor-owned distribution utilities, energy service companies, otherwise known as ESCOs, community choice aggregation programs, CCAs, not served by ESCOs, jurisdictional municipal utilities, any retail customer self-supplying through the NYSO. And this term, most notably, does not include NYPA or LIPA. Next slide, please. The 2016 CES order explained that NYPA and LIPA will participate in the CES not only to conform to a carbon requirement, but to engage in an integrated statewide policy. The ambition of the CLCPA's 70 by 30 target makes integrated statewide policy even more necessary than it was for our previous 50 by 30 goal. In the most recent CES annual report, NYPA and LIPA committed to adopting renewable targets that achieve the CES mandate. It will be important to ensure ongoing coordination with NYPA and LIPA with respect to their participation in NYSERDA's procurements of environmental attributes. Next slide, please. NYSERDA and staff expect that NYPA and LIPA will continue to participate in the 70 by 30 subject only to minor modifications as may be appropriate. You will see in the white paper that NYPA and LIPA have agreed to notify the Commission annually by filing a report on how they have contributed to the achievement of the CLCPA targets in the prior year, a notice indicating the extent to which they intend to participate in NYSERDA's annual CES procurements, and or fund their pro rata share of the attributes procured by NYSERDA in the coming year, which will certainly serve to help NYSERDA plan their procurement. And now, I will hand this over to Eric Scherer to discuss the load forecast and procurement trajectories.
Next slide, please. Good morning, I'm Eric Scherer, Senior Advisor for Clean Energy Strategy and Analysis at NYSERDA. And first of all, a quick reminder to anyone who may have joined late, you can use the Q&A function on your screen to submit any questions you may have, which we will look to address at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So as most people on this conference will be aware, the main mechanisms we have in place for pursuing our 70% target and also the 9 gigawatt offshore wind target are Tier 1 of the Clean Energy Standard, as well as the Offshore Wind Standard. And in order to pursue those goals, we need to have a load forecast in place because those two targets are expressed not in the same way as the procurements we conduct through Tier 1 and the Offshore Wind Standard. Those procurements are expressed in gigawatt hours per year. And so in the first instance, to know how much we need to procure, we need to translate the 70% and 9 gigawatt target in those terms. And I'll talk you through step by step how we've done that in the white paper. Next slide, please. So in order to figure out what our projection of a load forecast, an electric load forecast for 2030 is going to be, we need to take a view on various dynamics. First of all, things like changes in consumer behavior, but also a number of other dynamics that will impact the 2030 load forecast. And in particular there, we are conscious that our 70% target is part of a wider framework where we also have a wider target of reducing carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. And the pursuit of that target will entail important initiatives outside the electric sector that will, however, impact our electric load forecast. And in particular, I'm referring to beneficial electrification. So the increased adoption of electric vehicles and heat pumps, as well as electric energy efficiency, which reduces the electric load where heat pumps and electric vehicles increase the electric load forecast. And so in order to be consistent with that target, fortunately, we've just published an important piece of analysis that we refer to as our pathways analysis, which does exactly that. It provides analysis to assess both the delivery of the 40% carbon target as well as our 2050 target. And a link to that analysis is shown at the bottom of this slide. And in the white paper, we've made the connection with that analysis to leverage the load forecast that's expressed in that particular pathways analysis as also the basis of our load forecast projection in the white paper. And the figure of that load forecast is shown on the slide here, around 152 terawatt hours. Now, it's important, of course, to state that any forecast for 2030 is uncertain, and also the pathways analysis is subject to uncertainties. But as things stand, this is a useful metric, a useful piece of analysis that is a clear and obvious choice for us to connect with, to use as the forecast. So on the bottom of the slide, you can see a number of metrics that Pathways shows to indicate its assumptions on how these initiatives that I've referred to earlier will develop or may develop in this scenario, in particular energy efficiency and electrification. And you can see the assumptions made there that we will see substantive increases in sales rates of these various initiatives. And so we've translated those to a corresponding impact on the projected load forecast. Next slide, please. So here at the top of the slide, you can see how we've translated those pathways assumptions for our load forecast in the white paper. You can see the amount of gigawatt hours corresponding to the heat pump adoption trajectory as well as electric vehicles. For electric efficiency, it's slightly more complicated. Electric efficiency is, of course, energy that you didn't end up using. So in order to express it as a gigawatt hour numbers, you have to relate it to a trajectory where you would have used that amount of energy. And so the slightly above 40 terawatt hours of electric efficiency assumption that we used here, as shown on this slide, is in relation to the NYSO's 2019 forecast for 2030. And so you can see that taking these assumptions on these policy initiatives together then takes us to our 152 terawatt-hour 2030 load forecast. I mentioned, of course, again, that this is subject to uncertainty, and so we did want to express that uncertainty also in the analysis we're conveying in the white paper, in particular also in the cost-benefit analysis that we've carried out for the white paper, and we will hear more about that analysis in a moment. And so we want to be particularly conscious of potential impacts should the load turn out to be higher than in that base case scenario that we're using, because in that case, you would need to procure more in order to achieve the target. So that's an important scenario to also assess. And in order to assess that uncertainty, we've connected indeed with the NYSERDA's 2019 forecast for 2030, shown here on the screen as 161 terawatt-hours. And so this is a high load scenario that we've also carried out in the analysis. And so at the bottom of the screen, you can then see the resulting quantities that in each of these two scenarios are needed in order to deliver the 70% target. Next slide, please. We're not starting from scratch in achieving those amounts, of course. We are starting from a substantial baseline. And so the next step is then to account for that baseline, both in terms of the renewable electricity we already have in place in the state, as well as the efforts of our policy efforts so far, in particular on the tier 1 projects that we've already procured, as well as the offshore wind projects already procured, and also importantly our New York Sun 6 gigawatt distributed solar target. So you can see that those baseline contributions together add up to around 63 terawatt-hours. And a number of points to note in respect of those figures. The 2018 renewable generation level is sourced from our 2018 CES progress report. And we've made a couple of adjustments to the figures in that report to reflect the circumstances of the white paper. First of all, given that bioenergy is not an eligible source under the CLCPA, we've removed the amount of bioenergy from the 2018 report. And secondly, solar PV, as you can see in the table on this slide, is accounted for separately at the bottom of the table. And so we've also removed this from the 2018 quantity. A note on how we've accounted for the tier 1 projects. We're making an assumption of 20% attrition there on the amounts that have been contracted to be on the conservative side. And finally, on New York Sun, this includes both rooftop PV as well as distributed community scale solar. For rooftop PV, also known as behind the meter, we've grossed this up for line losses, and this reflects the approach throughout, that all figures you'll see here in pursuing the targets are expressed at the generation level. Next slide, please. And so if you set the amount of 63 terawatt-hours that we just looked at against the overall figure we need to achieve, that then leaves you with the amount that we still have to work on over the coming years. And as I mentioned, the main mechanisms there are the Offshore Wind Standard and the Tier 1 of the Renewable Energy Standard. And so we've split that difference between these two initiatives in the white paper. First of all, by starting with an assumption on the trajectory that's needed to deliver the 9 gigawatt offshore wind target. And that gets you to an amount of almost 18 terawatt-hours that would be in place in time for the 2030 70% target. And then the remainder falls to Tier 1, at least in our current projection. But it's important to note that there are, of course, other initiatives that can also contribute to what's still needed for the 70% target. In particular, any distributed solar that will likely come forth after the 2025 6 gigawatt target has been achieved, as well as the potential contribution from the proposed Tier 4. So to the extent that those kinds of contributions materialize, then you could expect Tier 1 to need to deliver less than the amount of about 25 terawatt hours that's indicated on this slide. Next slide, please. And so then the final step remains to convert those total amounts for offshore wind and Tier 1 that we saw on the previous slide into annual procurement numbers. As a starting point, we can see that for both offshore wind and Tier 1, we're looking at seven annual procurement rounds in each case, starting from the current year. The graph on the right-hand side of this slide shows both the Tier 1 figures in green, and you can see those going out to 2026, which is with an assumed 4-year lag to show procurements that would still deploy in time to contribute to the 2030 goal. And you can also see the offshore wind procurements going out to 2027. Note that for offshore wind, we assume a longer time lag to deployment. So the blue bars show here the assumed procurements that would contribute to the 2035 goal. One final point to make here, which is that all the figures we've just discussed so far are the contributions to the target in gigawatt hours, especially as regards Tier 1. As I mentioned earlier, though, we do take account of an assumption of attrition where not all of the projects we procure would ultimately materialize. And so specifically for Tier 1, the annual number of just over 3,500 gigawatt hours, once you add the 20% attrition assumption to it, then that gets you to an annual procurement number of just under 4,500 gigawatt hours. So that concludes the discussion of how we've determined the load forecast and the annual average procurement numbers. We are also proposing in this white paper to change the approach to using those annual procurement figures where, as you'll probably be aware, so far we've had in place firm annual procurement figures, and we're proposing a different approach using annual average procurement targets, and Corinne will talk more about that in a moment. But first, let me hand it over to Matt Vestal, who will talk us through our cost-benefit analysis that we conducted in respect of both the Tier 1 and offshore wind procurement figures. And with that, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Vestal. Thank you, Eric. Again, this is Matt Vestal. I am Senior Advisor to the large-scale renewables team at NYSERDA. And I will be speaking to the cost and benefit analysis that was executed as part of this white paper for the next several minutes, and then also leading into some of the cost and benefit results, again, as included within the white paper itself. So next slide, please. Thank you. And so first, I believe it's worth noting that the framework for the cost and benefit analysis is such that we were seeking to assess the cost and benefits associated with the achievement of 70% renewables by 2030, as well as 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. We're well familiar with these targets as being those that are outlined and set through the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Technologies that were assumed to be primarily supportive of these targets were solar PV, land-based wind, and offshore wind. These do not represent the full suite of technologies that are eligible to support the CLCPA mandates. However, they are those that we expect to be most meaningful in their contributions. The cost of procuring each technology is a function of a number of variables. However, we think of cost primarily as being a function of resource potential, which is effectively both the types of sites and the number of sites that are available for potential development, within New York State, and also the cost of those specific resources. The cost of developing that technology can include things such as the purchase of actual technology, but also this is a function of very site-specific nuances, whether it be topography, distance from transmission lines, the size of an individual site, et cetera. And I'll speak a bit more about how we drive those costs momentarily. However, it is worth noting that looking at technology costs is only one side of the equation. So we also do pair that review of the cost of resources with the value that those resources are expected to bring to New York ratepayers. The value is broken down between three buckets. The first two being energy pricing, or energy revenue, I should say, and capacity revenue. And then the third being avoided carbon emissions, which we value and take into account in our cost benefit analysis as well. So that kind of sets the framework, again, for how the cost and benefit analysis was executed. This is very similar to similar cost and benefit analyses that we've seen through previous filings, whether it be through the CES back in 2016 or through the Offshore Wind Policy Options paper back in 2018. So before getting into the details on the next few slides, do first want to acknowledge the contributions of two of our primary contractors, the first being Sustainable Energy Advantage, SEA, who was supportive of us through or for our forecasting of land-based technology resources primarily, and then also for the support of Renewables Consulting Group, RCG, for their support of our offshore wind analysis. Next slide, please. Whenever we consider solar PV and land-based wind, the first step in determining resource costs and availability is to perform a geospatial analysis to identify statewide technical resource potential for both of these technologies. This is a very detailed analysis, as you can tell from the graphics on the towards the bottom of the slide. Where on the left we see land-based wind potential sites, and on the right we see potential sites for utility scale solar. This geospatial analysis considers statewide resources and then applies constraints for a number of factors. This can include existing land use, so things like commercial, residential, agriculture, et cetera, the distance to existing substations and transmission lines, as well as the size of continuous area. Whenever these constraints are applied, what is left is something similar to what you see again in these graphics here, and those sites are then deemed eligible to potentially support the CLCPA mandates, and we then apply cost forecasting to those resources to observe the value that they can bring to the state. Next slide, please. A similar analysis is done on the offshore wind side. However, the state of play for site acquisition and development is quite a bit different whenever we consider the ocean space. And so this slide shows a combination of both existing federal lease areas and potential future federal lease areas. For those who are intimately familiar with the offshore wind landscape, we know that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is responsible for the leasing of these lease areas. And what we'll see here is that all of the figures that are denoted with an OCS at the beginning of their site name are executed lease areas, whereas sites such as Hudson North, Hudson South, Fairways North, and Fairways South are only draft wind energy areas at this point in time. But we do expect that some balance of those sites are advanced in the near future to be additional resources available for New York State and the surrounding area. And so altogether, these sites aggregate to form 15 offshore wind lease areas that are modeled as potential sites for delivery to New York State. The analysis, however, does recognize that these are truly regional resources, And so we do model some of these resources being removed over time to reflect the expected ongoing procurements from other regional states such as New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, a primary input to our work is the cost forecasting, the technology cost forecasting of our three technologies. And so first we will discuss, again, solar PV and land-based wind. And then on the next slide, we will discuss, or in a couple slides, we will discuss offshore wind as well. And so on this slide, we see how we derive the base case CAPEX, capital cost forecast for solar PV and land-based wind. In the cases of both of these technologies, we have selected base case projects to form baseline cost assumptions, which are then modified to reflect the site-by-site nuances and bespoke characteristics of individual sites. And so in the case of solar PV, we model a 10 to 25 megawatt site. And in the case of land-based wind, our base case project is a 200 megawatt site. Again, in both cases, then there are adjustment factors that are applied to those cost profiles to give us a best estimate of the actual technology cost associated with a given site in question, as identified a couple slides ago on the resource potential map. However, that is only one component of the work to have those starting CAPEX values identified. From there, we also need to develop experience curves, which provide an assessment of the long-term CAPEX forecasts, which we do expect to deliver savings over time, as observed in the market over the past several years. Continued competition, technology growth, et cetera, have delivered meaningful reductions in technology cost across the world, and New York is expected to be able to take advantage of those cost reductions as well. And so we do see, again, for both solar PV and land-based wind, a reduction in capital cost trajectory over time. For solar PV, on the bottom left graphic, we do see 4 lines here. This is because there are 4 notable technology options available for solar PV developers. Those include both 2 types of panels, monofacial and bifacial, as well as 2 types of tracker systems, whether they be fixed tilt or single axis trackers. So all 4 of those technologies are modeled. Things are a bit more simple on the land-based side, as there really is only one true technology choice. However, individual sites are modeled at different hub heights, again, depending on different site-by-site characteristics. Next slide, please. On the offshore wind side, we see that the cost buildup is quite similar to what was performed for land-based resources. However, it is worth noting a few nuances that make this resource stand out or be modeled in a slightly different way. And so towards the top half of this slide, we do see that CAPEX assumptions are broken down into several notable buckets, including project development costs, turbine and foundation supply, and a number of other ancillary technology costs. The base case estimates, again, taking a similar approach to what was done for land-based resources, are then adjusted based on a number of site-specific characteristics. For offshore wind, the base case project was selected as an 800 megawatt project, so that is notably higher than for solar and for land-based wind. However, given the market that has developed in the U.S. for offshore wind, that has been made kind of clear as a baseline value for U.S. offshore wind projects. There are some projects being developed slightly below that threshold, and some above, but 800 megawatts is a good representation of an average project in the U.S. offshore wind market. So again, that base case project is modified for a number of site-specific factors, including wind resource, the water depth, and the distance from an individual site to a port facility, transmission distances, and then a few other very nuanced inputs such as vessel strategy, the size of the individual turbines, which can range from 18 up to the high 20s in terms of megawatts of an individual turbine, depending on the year in which that turbine is being deployed, and then also foundation type, which can vary based on the soil conditions at an individual site. Next slide, please. This slide shows the LCOE forecast for an individual offshore wind project. This is that base case 800 megawatt offshore wind project that I described on the previous slide. The offshore wind supply stack is again more limited than what we see on the land-based side, primarily because we do require those leases to be delivered from the federal government in order to be eligible, at least for those ocean-based resources, to participate and to deliver energy to New York State. And so again, we see a fairly steep supply stack due to those limited areas, and also noting the competition that we see for those lease areas from other states. And so again, noting that this slide does show the cost curve for an individual site at a fixed capacity of 800 megawatts, but we do see, again, considerable cost declines over time at about 2% nominal growth rate. But again, this graphic is shown in real reductions in LCOE over time. Next slide, please. As noted previously, this cost-benefit analysis does pair an assessment of the cost of delivering resources with the value that those resources can bring to New York State. And so first and foremost is the value driven through wholesale energy markets. For this analysis, we utilized the 2019 NYSO KEROS 1 energy price forecast as the base case wholesale energy price forecast. That forecast runs through 2028, and thereafter we assume that pricing remains constant in real dollar terms, as observed in the graphic to the left here. It is worth noting, and I will detail this in future slides as well, that our analysis did consider a number of sensitivities to our base case analysis. Those sensitivities do include a low energy price scenario, in which case we have discounted the long-term energy market value by 2025, those long-term energy values are discounted by 25% for 2028 and thereafter. So that discount increases over time to reach 25% in 2028 and then remains flat thereafter. And again, that is just in the low energy price sensitivity. Next slide, please. Similarly, we do need to select a long-term valuation for the value of capacity for these resources. And so for this forecast, we are utilizing the capacity forecast provided by the BCA order establishing the benefit cost analysis framework, which is case 14N0101. In this case, we have a forecast which runs through 2039, and thereafter, again, we do hold capacity prices flat in real dollar terms, as observed in a graph to the left. We should note that forecast does provide zonal ICAP prices for summer and winter seasons, in which case we have translated those values into annual UCAP prices using translation factors and site-specific generation nuances, again, that are very much pivotal in the derivation of capacity value for these resources. So again, this is just the baseline ICAP forecast that is shown here on the left-hand side of this slide. Next slide, please. The third component of value that I had noted previously is going to be the value associated with the avoided carbon emissions that are offset again through the generation of green electricity. And so what we see here is the value of the social cost of carbon, which is taken from the EPA's technical update of the social cost of carbon for the regulatory impact analysis under Executive Order 12866. We should note that this forecast we have adopted, but do recognize that the RGGI program does include a value of carbon embedded within it. So that is noted here as a pecuniary value of CO2 in the graph to the left, and that has been excluded from the social cost of carbon forecast to avoid any double counting. Next slide, please. Great, and so from here, again, we hope that those previous slides have provided a bit of a backdrop for the methodology of how we both ascribe cost and value to solar PV and wind and offshore wind resources. However, that is one part of the equation, and now noting that whenever we apply those inputs to the resource potential that we have available in the state, we can arrive at a total cost and benefit assessment of reaching the 70 by 30 and the 9 gigawatt by 2035 goals. And those are what I can outline here in the following slides. So next slide, please. So first, to provide a few high-level observations of the analysis. First and foremost, that the development of land-based wind and offshore wind to meet the targets associated with the CLCPA do result in our forecast in a significant net benefit for New Yorkers, delivering a total bill impact of only approximately 1.4%. Again, that is to reach the 70 by 30 target. So that 1.4% reflects the program cost associated with acquiring those resources, and so that does not include the offsetting value of avoided carbon emissions, but those will be detailed on the following slides. The third bullet here does note that in a low energy pricing scenario, the program cost could more than double. This is because the structure of REC acquisition, which will be noted in future slides as well, is such that REC prices are expected to dynamically adjust over time, inversely with wholesale market pricing, both in the energy and the capacity space. And so REC price is a function of long-term energy and capacity pricing. However, even in this low energy pricing scenario, lifetime bill impacts do not exceed 1.2% for the Tier 1 procurements or 1.5% for offshore wind procurements. We do want to call out explicitly, however, that the impact of any of these increases in program costs as a result of lower energy prices or capacity prices would be counterbalanced by benefits to ratepayers in the form of lower electricity bills. Next slide, please. This slide here highlights the aggregate impact from both the Tier 1 development as well as the offshore wind development, again, to support 70 by 30 explicitly. And so the green bars to the left will see the impacts and both in terms of cost, value, and then net societal benefit for Tier 1. And so we do see, again, a modest program cost through 2030. However, that is offset or more than offset by a material carbon benefit, arriving at a $7.7 billion net benefit through 2030 for those Tier 1 resources. Similarly, on the offshore wind side, we see that those, again, the offsetting of the program cost by the carbon benefit results in a $4 billion net benefit from those offshore wind resources. We do want to call out, however, that by extending this analysis through 2035, which is required to capture the full 9 gigawatt program on the offshore wind side, we see that these aggregate net societal benefits increase to more than $17 billion, again, through 2035. Lastly, do want to note that these net societal benefits capture only the value of avoided carbon and do not include any other environmental benefits such as avoided PM 2.5 and other health benefits. Next slide, please. This slide shows base case results for Tier 1 resources. Again, I've noted that we did run several sensitivities as well. Those are going to be shown on the following slide. But again, we wanted to give a glimpse of base case results primarily. And so lots of figures on this or within this table. However, I do want to call your attention to a few dynamics to observe and kind of relationships that persist across the scenarios. And so first and foremost, I want to highlight that we do see that solar PV or provides more generation to meet our 70 by 30 targets than land-based wind. This is a function of two primary factors, one of which is cost, but second is resource potential as well. And so both are certainly we expect to be meaningful contributions to meeting our 70 by 30 goals, but in our modeling, we do show, again, that solar PV has a more meaningful long-term contribution. On the cost side, and this is shown in the bottom three rows of the top table, we do see that LCOE for these resources remains fairly flat over time. We see some increases followed by some decreases. This is reflective of what we saw in previous slides with the CAPEX forecasts reducing over time. So the cost of individual resources are expected to reduce over time. However, we also note that as we procure low-cost resources, those resources will be no longer available to the state in future years because they've already been procured. And so we are, in effect, working up a supply stack to meet our long-term procurement goals, which results in, again, a fairly steady LCOE trajectory over the longer term. Another observation to make is shown in the bottom two rows of this table, which do show that the year one REC prices are generally higher than the levelized REC prices. Again, this is because of the procurement structure I noted previously, called the index REC structure, which is one where the REC prices are derived as a function of wholesale energy and capacity prices. And so therefore, generally we would expect that if energy and capacity prices are increasing over the longer term, then we would expect REC prices to fall over the longer term, resulting in this dynamic, again, where year one REC prices are generally higher than the levelized value of those procured RECs. The bottom table here does show, again, the aggregate results of the Tier 1 base case, resulting in that $7.7 billion benefit that was highlighted on the previous slide. With that, we can go to the next slide. This slide highlights several of the scenarios that were run, again, for Tier 1 resources. Again, many figures here. We do encourage folks who are interested in this analysis to review Appendix A of the white paper for a more detailed review and observation of these results. However, we do want to quickly just call your attention to the fact that in each one of these scenarios, we are seeing modest impacts in the form of levelized bill impacts in the column to the far right. And in every single case, material lifetime net benefits to New Yorkers, generally in the range of about $5.7 billion up to nearly $10 billion, again, depending on the scenario that is being analyzed. With that, we can go to the next slide. Great, and now looking at offshore wind. Again, first want to call attention to some base case results. We do see here that in order to reach our 9 gigawatt target by 2035, we are modeling fairly consistent procurement targets on an annual basis, with about 1,000 megawatts being procured through 2029, and then slightly more than 1,000 after 2031. We will note that the white paper, however, does allow for flexibility both on the offshore wind and the Tier 1 side in terms of annual procurement volumes, but this is the base case trajectory, of course, which was selected for the analysis. So want to call attention to again, similar dynamics as we saw on the Tier 1 side in the space of LCOE and OREC prices over time. And so we observe towards the bottom of this top table that the LCOE of the projects that are procured on an annual basis, they go or forecasted to go up in some years and then down, again reflective of contrasting forces of moving up a supply curve while also benefiting from improved technology gains over time. But similarly, we do see the year 1 OREC prices are generally higher than their levelized counterparts, again because of that structure with the index, in this case an index OREC structure, which again we'll talk to in future slides. In the case of offshore wind, however, we have analyzed this portfolio temporally in 2 fashions. The first of which is considering the offshore wind portfolio and its supports of 70 by 30, but then also extending that time horizon through 2035 to assess the full cost and benefit story for reaching, again, 9 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity by that 2035 horizon. So we'll see that in the bottom table where we see a $4 billion net benefit through 2030, but again, through extending that time lens, the benefit more than doubles to nearly $10 billion through 2035. Similarly, we do see that levelized bill impacts are just south of 1% for resources acquired to meet 70 by 30 and extend just north of 1% for that 2035 analysis as well. Next slide, please. A similar suite of scenarios were run for the offshore wind analysis as well. Again, many figures here, and we do encourage folks to review Appendix A should they want to dig in more detail to these numbers. However, similar observations to highlight being that regardless of the scenario that was selected, we do see material lifetime net benefits in all cases for for scenarios analyzing the portfolio through 2030. We see lifetime net benefits ranging from about $2 billion to nearly $5 billion. And whenever that analysis is extended through 2035, we see net benefits ranging from about $6 billion to north of $11 billion. So again, very meaningful net benefits to New Yorkers in all cases for both the Tier 1 and the offshore wind portfolio. And so with that, I am going to pause and turn things back over. But we'll be speaking to the group again shortly regarding offshore wind. I believe I'm turning things back over to Corinne DiDomenico.
Thank you, Matt. And can you confirm you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thank you very much, Matt. And yes, we'll have Matt back to talk about our offshore wind proposals. So as we mentioned in the white paper, it contains certain modifications for our Tier 1 program. Next slide, please. In order to meet the 70 by 30 target, procurement volumes must increase and projects must be truly viable. Therefore, the following adjustments to the Tier 1 procurement process have been proposed. First, that annual procurements have flexible targets. This would be necessary to achieve the 70 by 30 target with no minimum or maximum quantity, and it would allow NYSERDA to have flexibility to respond to market conditions over time. 2, to remove projects that are not presently viable. This would authorize NYSERDA to reject a proposal outright upon unanimous determination by the technical evaluation panel that the project is not presently viable. 3, broaden portfolio risk factors. We would develop a new portfolio risk factor intended to consider the interactive effects caused by the increasing penetration of renewable energy resources on the grid. We will need to pay increased attention to interactive effects among these resources. There will be increased potential for curtailment, the need for dispatchable resources, complementary transmission development, and reliability dynamics. Next slide, please. We also propose to consolidate project viability, operational flexibility, and peak coincidence evaluation factors. We would merge these factors into one category, weighted at 20%, and will become increasingly intertwined with project viability as, again, the increased penetration of renewable energy. We also included in the white paper clarification and continuation of our CES delivery requirements. For renewable generators located in an adjacent control area, the electricity associated with the RECs must be scheduled, transmitted, delivered, and settled in the NYSO energy market in each hour and must be accompanied with documentation of a unit-specific contract path between the point of injection in the control area of origin to the delivery point in the New York State control area. Well, that was pretty quick. There were not very many proposals there. Matt, you there to take over for our offshore wind proposal?
I am here. Great. So again, I wanted to spend just a couple minutes highlighting some of the qualitative proposals made regarding the offshore wind program within the white paper. So if we could please jump to the next slide. Great. So as a quick reminder, we wanted to highlight that in January of this year, NYSERDA did submit a petition requesting the authority to conduct a 2020 solicitation for between 1,000 and 2,500 megawatts of offshore wind. Just a few short months later, in April, the Commission did grant NYSERDA's petition and issued the 2020 offshore wind order that largely extended the principles of the Phase 1 order from a couple years prior, while also recognizing a couple key factors of the program's evolution. First and foremost, the order did acknowledge the market's acceptance of the index OREC pricing structure, and therefore did direct NYSERDA to use a procurement mechanism that was consistent with the Commission's January 2020 order governing RES procurements. So in a quick summary, we just want to highlight that January 2020 order on the RES side did did represent a pivot in RES procurement methodology where on our future solicitations would be allowed to incorporate both a fixed REC structure and an index REC structure. Those structures were first introduced through the Offshore Wind Policy Options paper back in January of 2018. They were executed through the 2018 offshore wind solicitation and again incorporated into the RES program through the January 2020 order. And so this April 2020 offshore wind order effectively incorporated some alignment of the RES in the offshore wind program so that the procurement mechanisms across Tier 1 and offshore wind are expected to be similar going forward. Next slide, please. The white paper does include a formal proposal for the adoption of the CLCPA's minimum statewide goal of reaching 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035, and more specifically, the authority for NYSERDA to procure the amount of ORECs necessary to achieve that goal while retaining some flexibility to do so in an effective manner. And so the graphic at the bottom of this slide highlights progress to date, the impact that could be seen through the upcoming procurement that was authorized through that April 2020 order, as well as the work to be done in future years, again, to meet that 2035 goal. And so the 1,826 megawatts that have already been procured represent both the Empire Wind and the Sunrise Wind project that NYSERDA procured back in 2018, as well as the South Fork project, which has a contract with the Long Island Power Authority. Again, NYSERDA's upcoming solicitation is expected to result in up to 2,500 megawatts of incremental contracted capacity with a minimum requirement of 1,000 megawatts. So the size of that bar could certainly change, and then future solicitations will be sized appropriately so that 9 gigawatts of offshore wind is reached in time for the CLCPA requirements of 2035. Next slide, please. We do also want to highlight that transmission for offshore wind has been specifically addressed within the white paper. We have noted that while we have recognized that there are stakeholder voices that call for coordinated transmission solutions, we see that it is nearly impossible or quite difficult to design or evaluate such coordinated transmission solutions with any real certainty until we have additional wind energy areas that have been moved forward to leasing by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And so this was executed in the 2018 solicitation, and will also be executed in similar fashion for the 2020 solicitation, where transmission will be built to support single projects, or at least that is the base case expectation in NYSERDA solicitations. Again, for transmission in the offshore wind space. However, NYSERDA and its state partners will continue to study the potential for alternative transmission networks, as well as the required onshore transmission upgrades that may be necessary to accommodate the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And this is, of course, as required by the recently enacted Accelerated Renewable Act as well. And so I think more to hear from NYSERDA and then DPS on this front in the future. Next slide, please. We also do want to highlight a couple of nuances found within the white paper regarding the resale of ORECs, as well as compliance for other offshore wind projects. So specifically, NYSERDA has requested the authority to resell ORECs to non-LSE buyers. Those are load-serving entity buyers. However, that would be at a cost that is no less than it sells those ORECs to load-serving entities. The white paper also proposes that the Commission clarify that those load-serving entities are free to procure ORECs directly for their own compliance and do not necessarily need to purchase those from NYSERDA. Again, this is a request in the white paper for the Commission's clarification. If other offshore wind projects are developed for delivery into the NYPA without NYSERDA's involvement, then NYSERDA would reduce its own procurement targets accordingly, again, to ensure that overall state compliance at a minimum meets the CLCPA requirements of 9 gigawatts by 2035. Next slide, please. Great. The white paper also does highlight or propose the development of a feasibility study for offshore wind in the Great Lakes. This feasibility study would seek to understand effectively the overall value and viability for wind in the Great Lakes. The white paper does recognize the Great Lakes region as a potentially valuable incremental resource for the state in support of its CLCPA related targets, but you recognize that there is considerable work to be done, again, to assess value, viability, et cetera, of that potential resource before moving forward or before considering moving forward with eligibility determinations for offshore wind within the Great Lakes region. And so that is highlighted again explicitly within the white paper. And so with that, I will pause again and pass things back to Corinne. Thank you. Or I may be passing things to Eric Scherer.
Yes, I think that's my cue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So I will briefly summarize the white paper proposal on repowering. Next slide, please. So the white paper recognizes that the current approach to repowering is somewhat restrictive in that if you look at the graph shown here on the left-hand side of the slide, under the current policy, when a site that's already generating renewable electricity seeks to repower, only the incremental generation shown here as the green block would be eligible for Tier 1. The thinking behind the white paper proposal on repowering is to say that it effectively makes sense to offer Tier 1 RECs to any generation that exceeds what we would otherwise have received from that site. And so in the same graph, if you look at the gray bit as a representation of what an existing site might be expected to generate, so that generation might decline over time and then cease at the end of the useful life of the existing site, then we're saying any generation that's incremental to that, it would be reasonable for that generation to receive Tier 1 RECs. The generation from the existing site might then still be eligible for Tier 2, but the proposal states that Tier 1 eligibility would be expanded from the green block shown at the top to also cover the orange colored generation that exceeds the projection of generation that would otherwise have occurred at the site. So that's the proposal in a nutshell. On the right-hand side of the slide, we also summarize a couple of more technical requirements put forward alongside that proposal around the capital expenditure and the amount of generation increase that would be expected from such proposals for repowering. And with that, I'll leave it at that in terms of our repowering proposal and hand it back to Corinne for the Tier 4 proposal.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, as we mentioned at the outset, the white paper does make a proposal for a new CES tier named Tier 4, as we already have three, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 under the CES. And this Tier 4 proposal proposes the creation of a Tier 4 large-scale renewable program to specifically value environmental attributes associated with renewable energy deliveries into New York City, specifically the New York ISO Load Zone J. Eligible resources would include hydropower resources subject to certain conditions to assure additional renewable energy delivery to New York State and to avoid merely shuffling clean energy resources away from neighbors. All other non-hydro eligible resources under the CLCPA must have a commercial operation date after the date of any order approving Tier 4. Next slide, please. Here we discuss additionality. The energy baseline included in the white paper proposal requires that the renewable energy generation delivered under Tier 4 exceeds a historical baseline of renewable energy that the supplier has historically delivered to New York. This would ensure that Tier 4 deliveries are not met through redirecting existing deliveries, which would provide no additional benefit to the state. A secondary condition is the greenhouse gas baseline, which requires renewable energy generation delivered to represent a net increase in the supplier's total renewable energy generation as compared to a baseline. This would be measured in megawatt hours of generation for renewables. This would ensure that Tier 4 deliveries are not being backfilled by fossil fueled resources in order to meet this new increased export demand, which would not reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. Here's some basics about the solicitation process that was proposed in the white paper and contracting. NYSERDA requests the authority to procure up to 3,000 megawatts of capacity under contracts up to 30 years of a term. We propose several methods by which to solicit these projects. One would be through an open RFP process, where applications would be reviewed by NYSERDA and DPS staff using evaluation criteria and weighting factors typically used in our Tier 1. This could be done through a standard offer, which would be procured through a predetermined rate, or through a bilateral negotiation, where a project-specific rate would be based on financial need, cost, and benefits specific to a project. And notably, there would be a Tier 1 price cap, which the white paper and the Secretary's notice both requested comment on any formulaic rate as to how this Tier 1 price would be set. Next slide, please. The white paper also proposed that there would be options available through joint purchasing and the resale of Tier 4 RECs. It may be necessary for NYSERDA to enter into transactions involving more than one purchaser, or to resell the Tier 4 RECs due to potential interest from other buyers. These would include LSEs or other large buyers, such as the city government itself. There could also be private entities seeking alternative compliance means through the purchase of RECs delivered to New York ISO Zone J, which may be eligible under compliance under the New York City Local Law 97. Next slide, please. Therefore, the white paper proposes that NYSERDA has the discretion to purchase any percentage or fixed quantity of RECs delivered by a selected project, or we could enter into contractual agreements with more than one entity as necessary. We could have the authority to procure both fixed and index RECs separately from the same project, if doing so results in the lowest levelized net cost. We also seek authority to resell the Tier 4 RECs to any purchaser, including compliance entities under Local Law 97, at a competitive price, subject to a price floor, at its own levelized procurement costs, including any administration costs, through the compliance year 2029. The white paper seeks comment on the price floor and how any revenues, if any, should be received would be redirected. Next slide, please. Because Tier 4 is an integral part of achieving our 70 by 30, it would be the financial responsibility of all LSEs serving retail load in the territory of the electric distribution companies. NYPA and LIPA, the white paper recommends that NYPA and LIPA should adopt Tier 4 targets proportional to their load share and reflect the statewide goals. After selling to voluntary buyers, the remaining Tier 4 RECs would be sold to LSEs for compliance with its obligation in proportion to its overall share of statewide load, similar to our process for the zero emissions credits. NYSERDA would file an implementation plan for stakeholder comment that will include the description of the compliance obligation, calculations, process and structure, as well as the standard purchase and agreement for the ultimate commission approval. Next slide, please. Competitive Tier 2. Next slide, please. Just a little background on the competitive Tier 2 petition, which was filed back in January. In June 2019, Senate Bill 23 was passed and established a Tier 2 price that would be set at 75% of the Tier 1 REC price. This would include eligible resources to be existing non-state-owned renewable energy resources and hydropower less than 50 megawatts located within the state of New York. It was proposed to be a non-competitive program, and it was estimated to cost approximately $1.3 billion. In December of 2019, Governor Cuomo vetoed the bill and directed NYSERDA and DPS to establish a competitive and cost-effective program. In January of 2020, NYSERDA filed a petition for a competitive program called the Tier 2. This would be eligible to existing non-state-owned run-of-river hydro and existing wind generators located within the state. It proposed 3 annual competitive solicitations for 3-year contracts. The program cost was proposed to be capped at $200 million. Through the comment period, NYPA submitted comments requesting eligibility for self-supply. The white paper seeks comment on whether and to what extent NYPA's renewable energy baseline resources should be eligible under self-supply. Next slide, please. And for this piece, Eric, did you have a chance to get a glass of water?
Hi, Corinne. Yes, I'm still here.
Hello.
Next slide, please. This slide discusses LSE Tier 1 compliance obligations. The white paper does not actually put forward any proposals to change the approach to LSE compliance obligations. However, at this time of the year, usually the next annual LSE compliance obligation would have been published through the divergence test. And so for practical reasons, we're taking the opportunity of the white paper to do indeed just that and put forward the 2023 LSE obligation level shown in the table on the right-hand side. At the same time as we carried out our latest revision of expected Tier 1 REC availability, we concluded that it would be appropriate to revise 2 annual targets that had been published previously, those for 2021 and 2022. And so as you can see in the table on the right-hand side, the targets for those 2 years are revised downward to reflect our latest expectation of RECs available and to thus avoid unnecessarily burdening ratepayers with percentage targets that are higher than what we expect is available in the market. And so that's the short summary of the white paper in respect of the LSE obligations. And with that, back to Corinne.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, for administrative funding. Next slide, please. NYSERDA proposed through the white paper to have a new annual administrative funding request that would combine all funding requests for all the CES programs into one comprehensive annual funding request. NYSERDA also proposed to include administrative adders for programs that we would anticipate having an adequate supply of Tier 1 RECs, ZECs, and Tier 2 RECs, if adopted, available for sale in 2020.
Good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. It's Doreen Harris. Unfortunately, Corinne lost her audio, so just please hold for 1 minute while she reconnects. Sorry for the delay.
Hi, Doreen, can you hear me?
Yep, you're back.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, everyone. Call was dropped. I'm not sure where I got dropped there.
You were pretty much through the fact about the RECs that we would be selling.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So administrative funds for the 2021 compliance period. John, please, next slide. Great, thank you. So this would include Tier 1 RECs plus commission-approved adder at the start of each quarterly sale, a ZEC rate plus commission-approved adder at least 2 months before the commencement of the compliance year, Tier 2 rates plus the commission-approved adder for the compliance year on the website by December 31, 2021. And given that offshore wind and Tier 4, if adopted, are not anticipated to produce attributes to sell in 2021, NYSERDA proposes to continue to utilize SBC funds, EAPs, and RPS uncommitted balances to cover administrative funds for the offshore wind program and the Tier 4 program if adopted. As typical, NYSERDA will allocate a proportionate share of the New York State cost recovery fee to all of these CES programs. Next slide, please. Reporting. As we typically do, NYSERDA produces a lot of reports on many different aspects of our program. And so we will continue to report on all of the programs as we have. And we propose to combine and streamline the program as we move forward. Oh, Tom, please, next slide. Excuse me, John, thank you. LSCs are required to submit a report in NIGAP documenting their annual Tier 1 RES compliance activities, which would be a continuation of that. Notably, the CLCPA requires a biennial review. Therefore, we propose that the triennial review, as previously adopted under the Phase 3 implementation program, would not continue after 2020 and would therefore be replaced with a biennial review as required by the CLCPA. So that's pretty straightforward. Tom Dwyer, are you ready to take us through next steps?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. And Tom, why don't you introduce yourself briefly for the audience?
Sure. So good morning, folks. My name is Tom Dwyer. I'm Assistant Counsel here at the Department of Public Service. And, we're going to turn now to the Q&A portion of this conference, but I'd like to first thank those who submitted questions in advance last week. We have compiled those and will strive to respond to all the questions relevant to the proposals contained in the white paper, including those received today during the conference. Before we start, though, I just want to echo Chair Rhodes' comments regarding the importance of stakeholder feedback, which is an essential part of the regulatory process. And I want to remind everyone of the upcoming opportunities to provide comments. The notice scheduling this conference requested initial feedback by July 24th, which, in addition to providing feedback on the white paper and the proposals therein, will help the team to understand if further stakeholder outreach is warranted. Additionally, formal comments will be accepted through August 31st, at which time this will be ripe for a commission decision. I'd also like to highlight the questions posed in both the white paper and the notice scheduling this conference as areas on which the team is seeking specific feedback in both sets of comments. So with that, I think we can dive right into the Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to Corinne.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so as we mentioned, we've got submitted Q&A. We received quite a bit of questions, and we will venture to get through all of them and then move on to our live Q&A. And thanks to the team who are behind the scenes organizing those questions so that we can respond to those and use our time efficiently. You will just bear with me here. I will also note that we received quite a bit of questions on the details of implementation. And generally, you will notice that there are, I will say there's a lot of flexibility provided in the white paper regarding the implementation because we really are seeking feedback from stakeholders so that the eventual order could contain the program specifics that would meet, obviously, or at least consider all of the stakeholders' input. And so the white paper directly asked for comment on a lot of those specifics, and so clearly we could not answer all of those questions as we intended to ask for stakeholder feedback. But we certainly encourage all parties to submit your questions as well as comments and proposals for the implementation details. For the submitted questions, we will venture to answer them by topic. However, when it comes to the live Q&A, we will be answering them as they were received generally. Okay, so for our first question, how would NYSERDA go about determining if the project is not viable with respect to section 2.C.1.II of the white paper? The response is that NYSERDA, DPS, and the independent evaluators that comprise each solicitation's technical evaluation panel would make such a determination based on the criteria outlined in this white paper. Projects that are not sufficiently developed to a point at which their viability can be reliably assessed, projects that exhibit unrealistic bidding assumptions, and projects that exhibit significant risk without identifying appropriate mitigation strategies could each be subject to determination that the project is not presently viable or to be contracted. Another question was, how would NYSERDA evaluate projects with respect to likely congestion and curtailment? Page 33 of the white paper states, for any new portfolio risk factor adopted, NYSERDA would publish a description in its RFP at a sufficient level of detail to allow bidders to make any responsive adjustments to their projects that may be possible. NYSERDA would also publish a description of how the portfolio risk factor would be used in the selection process. Another question in the same vein. Will congestion and curtailment issues be evaluated twice, once in the 20% factor for project viability, operations flexibility, and peak coincidence, and then again as a portfolio risk factor? The project viability, operations flexibility, and peak coincidence factors will be evaluated and assessed on a project-specific basis, while the portfolio risk factor will be assessed against the portfolio of projects under consideration for selection and award. Next question on Tier 1. The white paper recommends that NYSERDA receive the authority to develop new portfolio risk factors that account for interactive effects. What is the timeline for adopting these factors and incorporating them into our RFPs? These new factors would be employed as part of the first solicitation conducted after the receipt of a commission's order, if the timing allows. Another question on Tier 1, will the criteria for portfolio risk factors evaluated still be limited by the 10% change to generation weighted average cost? The answer is that the white paper does not propose a change to the generation weighted average cost containment mechanism established by the Clean Energy Standard order and would remain in effect unless otherwise prescribed in some future order by the PSC. So now Tier 2 questions, which I'm going to toss some of these to my colleagues. First up, Tom Dwyer. Is the decision to establish a competitive Tier 2 going to be made in the same order as the 70/30 policy order?
Thanks, Corinne. So, I mean, I'll just start by saying that ultimately the Commission sets its agenda. So we can't say at this time for certain how the Commission will take up the Tier 2 petition as well as the issues addressed in the white paper. It's certainly possible that those two topics could be addressed together, but could also be addressed separately. Again, the Commission will determine when to take up those issues.
Thank you, Tom. Next question here. Would there be a possibility of NYSERDA holding a Tier 2 RFP in 2020? And I'll respond to that. Whether or not NYSERDA conducts a Tier 2 RFP in 2020 will ultimately depend on when the Tier 2 petition is addressed by the order, as Tom just mentioned, as well as the structure of the program that's ultimately adopted. And so just like NYSERDA responded quickly to the governor's veto, NYSERDA would certainly venture to respond quickly to any order that the commission issued on the Tier 2, but certainly we would need some time to incorporate any changes to the program as ultimately ordered. The next question I have here, I'm going to ask Tom Rienzo from DPS to respond to. Can you please clarify the question being posed in the white paper with respect to NYPA and Tier 2? Is it simply whether NYPA would be allowed to use its own hydropower resources to generate Tier 2 RECs to meet their own Tier 2 obligations? And if so, since the hydropower RECs are already counted in the baseline of existing resources and then subtracted out from other baseline generations to determine total generation, would that be relevant for Tier 2? Wouldn't the NYPA generation then be double counted? Pretty loaded question there, Tom. A few parts to it.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Yes, so the answer to that question is yes. The question being posed in the white paper is, if the Tier 2 is adopted by the Commission, should NYPA be allowed to satisfy its Tier 2 obligation with the RECs it generates from its own facilities? So that is the question being posed. I don't believe that there is a double count risk there, because the RECs that were included in the baseline would then be reallocated to Tier 2. And as you know, it's the sum of all of those tiers, the Tier 1, Tier 2, the voluntary market, all of those would be counted towards the 70 by 30 goal. So they would be reallocated, so there wouldn't be a risk of double count.
That's right. Thank you, Tom. And Tom, hold on. I've got another one here for you. With respect to this, will new Tier 4 RECs be procured and accounted for in a similar manner to ORECs and ZECs, or in some other manner?
So the white paper proposes to account for Tier 2 RECs in the same manner or similar manner as Tiers 1 and 3, except the white paper proposes that NYSERDA be allowed to sell the RECs, the Tier 4 RECs, to the voluntary market, thereby hopefully reducing the obligation, a Tier 4 obligation that would be left for other LSCs in the state. But basically, it would be a similar methodology.
Thank you. We've got another question here on the Tier 4 baseline, which I think I'll respond to. So the question is, the purpose of the GHG supplier baseline is to ensure that additional power delivered to New York from suppliers just not simply backfill with fossil generation. Can a supplier then instead backfill with new impounded hydro, which is ineligible for Tier 4, or are the supposed methane emissions from any new dams included as part of the GHG baseline or ongoing monitoring? And if so, how will they be calculated? So as the white paper proposal proposes, the eligibility for the procurement of Tier 4 purchases, those eligibilities are squarely for any purchases we would make under Tier 4. The supplier baseline would be calculated based on the megawatt hours of renewable energy resources. The next question here on Tier 4. Does a price cap benchmark to Tier 1 mean the same thing as capped to a Tier 1 price? The white paper solicits comment on both the most appropriate mechanism and or formula for benchmarking the Tier 4 price cap to a Tier 1 REC price. Further, it also seeks comment on whether a different price cap may be appropriate for projects that would bear the cost of merchant-funded transmission and thus avoid the need for a socialized cost allocation. And so certainly the white paper is intended to request a price cap, but we seek comment on how to calculate that price cap in both of those instances that we propose. Another question on REC allocation for our 70 by 30 is, if NYSERDA sold Tier 4 RECs to New York City building owners subject to Local Law 97, are those RECs counted toward both the 70 by 30 mandate and the building owner compliance with the local law? So as Tom mentioned before, the sum of all the CES tiers plus the voluntary market, which would include these private buyers, would be counted ultimately toward our 70 by 30 target. Tom Rienzo, I've got another question here for you. Can offshore wind delivered into Zone J fit into Tier 4?
The white paper doesn't specifically address that, although we intend Tier 4 to be separate and distinct from the offshore wind. I assume the developer would have the opportunity to choose whether it wanted to do a Tier 4 or an offshore wind, but not both, obviously. But I think we would be open to, the stakeholders' comments on that subject.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Another request for comments, so I hope folks will submit them. Another question on Tier 4 on the baseline. For the proposed Tier 4, is the supplier energy baseline the amount of power delivered into the New York control area, and the GHG baseline is the amount of power produced in total by that supplier? And the answer is generally yes. The GHG baseline would require that those purchases represent a net increase in the supplier's total renewable energy generation as compared to a baseline. Of course, as the purpose is to ensure that any purchases are not being backfilled by fossil resources. And again, the GHG baseline would be measured and calculated in megawatt hours. The next one here, Pete Keene, are you able to connect to the webinar here for an answer? I'll go ahead and ask the question, and Pete, if you're available, if not, I can take it here. How will Tier 4 eligibility be certified at New York's borders compared to other out-of-state generation in the generation attribute system, tracking system? On a granular level, which data points and methodology will be used to determine Tier 4 REC eligibility? Pete, were you able to connect? Okay. Well, page 34 of the white paper actually provides some very explicit directions on how renewable generators located in a control area adjacent to the New York ISO is required. The electricity associated with the REC must be scheduled, transmitted, delivered, and settled in the New York ISO energy market in each hour, and must be accompanied by the documentation of the unit-specific contract path between the injection point in the adjacent control area and the origin to the delivery point. And I won't sort of rehash all of the details, but you'll see that NERC tags will be required for documentation and one that is compatible with an IGAS. Okay, another question here. Can you please clarify how Tier 4 RECs would be allocated where a project contains both generation and transmission facilities to bring power to Zone J? Does the transmission developer obtain any renewable energy credits, or are they entirely owned by the generator? So this one, like any other RECs under the CES, Tier 4 RECs would belong to the generator upon generation. Okay. We're going to move on now to the next topic, procurement targets. Eric, just want to let you know you're up on deck for this question. And the projected amounts of needed wind and solar for Tier 1 forecasted in the CES cost analysis assume a certain amount of procurement via Tier 4, and if so, how much?
Hi, Corinne. The answer is no. And as I mentioned earlier, indeed, to the extent that Tier 4 or indeed other potential contributions to the target materialize, there is an opportunity in future years to then adjust the amounts and the procurement targets that would be needed for Tier 1.
Thank you. Will the size of Tier 1, I guess this is a very similar question, but just for the just to be absolutely clear, will the size of Tier 1 be adjusted each year to reflect the contribution of Tier 2 resources or any change in the baseline?
Yes, Corinne, and I noted there are a couple of other questions along a similar vein. So I think they all fall under the heading of noting that the white paper puts forward a proposal for the average annual procurement targets that I described earlier in the presentation to be reconsidered and revised every year. So every year we would take account of the latest available information, basically the same kinds of information that I discussed earlier in the presentation. So the latest information on baseline renewables and the outcomes of prior years' procurements to allow us to then revise the annual average procurement target as we go along through the years, with better and better data.
Thank you, Eric. The next question I have here for Tom Rienzo. All RECs procured when the LBMP is negative at zero price, would they still be counted toward the 70 by 30 mandate and could still be sold to LSEs?
Forgive me, my neighbors are now trimming their bushes directly outside my window, so I apologize for the background noise. Yeah, so all RECs, even RECs acquired in hours of negative LBMPs will count towards the 70 by 30 goal and will be available to LSEs.
Great, thank you. Okay, and Tom, hang on, we've got some more here. We're going to shift over to repowering, and we've received quite a bit of questions on that. Tom, how will the age of a hydro facility be established for the purposes of defining the useful life?
Well, the white paper assigns a useful life to hydro projects for 50 years. That would probably be based on the commercial operation date, using the commercial operation date as the threshold date. But I would remind people to remember that there are other factors that have to be met for repowering besides the useful life. There is the replacement of the prime mover, which must increase the output by more than 15% with one of the conditions. So everybody remember the prime mover for a hydro facility would mean replacing the generator, the entire turbine, and the structure supporting the turbine. There's also the condition that 80% of the tax basis, according to GAAP, must be completed as of or after the date of an order in this proposal. So there are a lot of other issues that you have to keep in mind other than just the useful life when we're thinking about repowering.
Thank you. Another question here for you, Tom, is does the current CES allow renewable facilities which are brought online after 48 consecutive months offline to qualify for Tier 1 RECs at 100% of their output, regardless of the total age of the facility? And if so, does the proposed repowering program supplant this?
Yes, there's nothing in the white paper that eliminates the return to service provision. So any project that is out of service, meaning doesn't generate at all for 48 months, could return to service as a Tier 1 eligible facility.
Thank you. on repowering, we received quite a bit of sort of questions that outlined several different scenarios, just in a general vein of particular facilities that meet one condition but maybe not all, or maybe could meet all but one condition. And just a general response to those scenario type questions is that the white paper proposes that all conditions for these repower facilities be met for eligibility. That would include the replacement of the prime mover, the 15% generation, as well as the capital expenditures, and any that I'm not listing right now. So just to clarify that all of those conditions, as proposed under the white paper, must be met for eligibility. We've got another question here on repowering. Would repowered projects that compete and win a Tier 1 contract have the same limits and deadlines to achieve commercial operation as other Tier 1 projects? And could that timeline vary for various reasons for repower that include pursuing FERC relicensing? Repowered projects would be competing in a Tier 1 RFP and would be subject to the same treatments of other projects in that RFP. Tom, I've got another one here for you on repowering. The white paper proposes that NYSERDA continue to impose the provision of Appendix A of the 2016 CES order that contains limits to hydroelectric resources, which include the incremental production associated with upgrades to existing facilities without any new storage impoundments, as well as low impact run-of-river projects. Are existing hydro facilities, including ones with impoundments, eligible for repowering as proposed in the white paper?
Yeah, so repowering facilities must be eligible for Tier 1, and the white paper does not propose any changes to those limitations. You know, those are the limitations that were included in Appendix A of the 2016 CES order. So it would not include impoundments, facilities that it would include a new impoundment, I guess, on as a Tier 1 eligible, and therefore would not be eligible for repowering.
Thank you. Okay, switching topics here. Matt, just to let you know, we're moving here to the cost-benefit analysis. We've got a question here about Appendix A, a table included there. It states expected capacity factors for land-based wind at values that are in their high 30s to low 40s. And given that existing wind has capacity factors which are about 25% or therearound, are the values in your table overly optimistic?
Thanks, Corinne. The values assumed for generation profiles and capacity factors for all technologies assessed in the white paper, including land-based wind, are reflective of active and long-term projections for these technologies. And so these are, again, for installations that are expected to occur in the mid-2020s through to the late 2020s and early 2030s in the case of offshore wind. And so these forecasts do take into account technology learning over that time, and certainly compared to some existing resources in the existing New York State offshore wind fleet, there are material expected technology advancements that are expected between those vintages of technology. That's both a function of again, just technology improvement over time, also in some cases, hub height improvements, scale of technology improvements, et cetera. So no, we don't believe that these are overly optimistic. We would also note that these forecasted values are reflective and consistent with the as-bid generation profiles that we receive through our regular solicitations, again, on both the land-based and the offshore wind side. So these are well-calibrated results to what we're seeing in the market today for new technology. Thank
you, Matt. Okay. We also received quite a few questions on carbon pricing, and Warren Myers, I'll ask if you could help us address that, but generally the questions were, how would you see carbon pricing interacting with each of the proposals or in general with the 70 by 30 goal?
Hi, thanks, Corinne. Good morning, everyone. So REC payments represent the bid-based abatement cost to meet the legislated CLCPA goals. To the extent that any wholesale pricing in the future includes an adder for carbon beyond the RGGI price that's already in there, payments for index RECs will drop automatically relative to what the REC payments would have been without carbon pricing. New York's index REC and OREC mechanisms are designed to respond to electricity price changes. And to read about this, this was discussed in the January 16th, 2020 Public Service Commission order on index RECs in this packet.
Thank you, Warren. Okay. We've got a question here on administrative funding, which I'll answer. Regarding the administrative funding, what is the total amount that NYSERDA has spent on the CRF, the cost recovery fee, that's been allocated to the CES program? So each year, NYSERDA files an annual CES financial status report, and this includes the explicit cost recovery fee expenses. You can find links to these filings on our CES website under Filings, Orders, and Reports, as well as DPS's DMM system for case 15E0302. Okay, so that's what we have for all of our submitted questions. We're going to move now over to the Q&A that's been submitted during the webinar. We've received quite a bit of questions, and so we're going to do our best here to manage the many questions that we received, as well as the multiple folks we've got standing at the ready. So if we have any new folks that I ask on our team to answer questions, please remember to briefly introduce yourself so we all know who we're speaking to. And I'm going to jump right in here. I will note that we received a few questions that reference the CLCPA's 2040 goal for zero emission resources. And I will just generally state that the proposal doesn't specifically address the 2040 goal. And so we won't be able to address those specific questions here. Warren, I've got a question here for you. Do you envision energy storage as being eligible for Tier 4?
Well, currently the offshore wind and Tier 1 programs both allow for energy storage paired with an eligible technology. The white paper doesn't explicitly address storage with respect to Tier 4, but we ask for stakeholders' input on that.
Thank you, Warren. Okay, and I'll also mention these questions are generally in the order received, so we're going to be jumping around different topics here. Matt, I have a question here for you. It says Table 1 in the white paper assumes a 50% capacity factor for offshore wind projects, substantially higher than the 43.5% presented in the policy option paper. Can you discuss that and if there are vendor guarantees?
Sure. Thanks, Corinne. So I can't speak to the 43.5% that was, or that the questioner referenced from the offshore wind policy options paper. However, I will note that similar to a response I gave just a couple minutes ago, the offshore wind capacity factors that were assumed for the white paper are reflective of our best estimates and best data that we have for wind speeds, wind profiles, et cetera, off the coast of the Northeast, and are in fact calibrated based on the as-bid generation values that we have received from our 2018 offshore wind solicitation. So again, similar to other technologies as well, we do expect for offshore wind technology to improve over time. So that is relative to previous vintages of projects. We do expect that later projects may benefit from increased turbine size for one, hub heights for another, allowing greater amounts of energy to be captured for every megawatt of installed capacity. And so our assumptions here are consistent with prevailing expectations from other third-party sources as well, generally with offshore wind capacity factors living in the mid to high 40s for current technology, up into the low 50s for future for future projects.
We've got a question here for Eric, and if I could ask John, if we could move the slide back to slide 17 for the audience. This question specifically on slide 17. Eric, what percentages? What do the percentages in the table on this slide mean? Meaning, what percentage of what specifically?
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you for also pulling slide 17 up, which definitely helps with the response to this question. So the percentages you can see here as quoted from our pathways analysis are annual sales rates. So as an example, the indication here would be that by 2030, 60% of light-duty vehicles would be sold in the form of electric vehicles. And I'll also take the opportunity here to point people, I know there were one or two questions about that as well, to the web link at the bottom of this slide where the Pathways report can be found. So perhaps we can leave the slide on just a little bit longer so anyone interested can note down that link.
Thank you, Eric. And again, we'll make these slides available, so also that link will be available after we post the slides for folks. Eric, well, I've got you here. I've got another question. Is the 6 gigawatt target expressed in direct current, and has the corresponding gigawatt hour value been converted to alternating current?
The answer is yes to both.
Thank you. Right. So this question is, and sorry, Matt or Eric, actually. I'm going to take this one to Matt. Matt, does the analysis take into account the timing of generation and load, for example, accounting for times of over-generation and under-generation with respect to load, or does it evaluate the amount of energy needed with considering timing and supply of load? I'm sorry, Eric, if that's more appropriate for you.
I am here.
Oh,
yep,
thank you.
That's okay. Thank you. Sure. So the analysis does consider seasonal generation with respect to energy prices, such that the generation profile of a given resource receives or is reflected to provide value to the New York State system in accordance with the hours in which that technology is expected to deliver energy to the system. So, of course, the value of energy in capacity, for that matter, is certainly reflective of the time of day and the season or month, I should say, in which that generation is provided. So, in that manner, the value provided by these resources is certainly reflective of that generation characteristic. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. And Matt, if you can hang on, it looks like you've got a few here. In the appendix of the white paper, in the appendix of the white paper, figures 11 through 12 show energy market prices. Which resources are assumed to set the clearing prices near and beyond 2030?
Sure. And so as a reminder, these energy price forecasts are CARES forecasts from 2019, and after 2030, these energy prices are held constant in real dollars. So that's the foundation of what is driving that energy price forecast. I would recommend probably for the most detailed analysis or methodology detail regarding that forecast, we can recommend readers to review the CARES documentation released by the New York ISO, but generally, consistent with kind of general market theory. There are a combination of resources that set clearing prices on a 5-minute or an hourly basis, depending on the time of day and the season, et cetera. And so I think we, again, would encourage readers to review CARES documentation for greater detail there. So can't speak specifically to what resources are setting those clearing prices, just given the complexity and the dynamic nature of that equation.
Thank you, Matt. I've got another one here for you. In the appendix, section 2.7.2 describes the assumption for network upgrade costs. How is the $30 per kilowatt year cost derived from the $1.2 billion project cost?
Thanks, Corinne. The $1.2 billion project cost is assumed as a basis, and then that cost is effectively annualized and socialized across a range of resources based on project-specific capacity factors that reflect a blend of technologies, but primarily wind and large hydro. So again, a fairly complicated equation there, but the essence is that total project cost is assumed to be socialized based on the capacity factor associated with individual technologies over the long-term project life from 20 to 30 years, depending on the technology in question.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Another one, why is the projected levelized REC Tier 1 price so much lower than the first year?
Sure, I think that's for me as well. And so, yeah, it may be useful to point folks to the relevant slide as well, which I can find the number here. I think slide 35 is going to be the best representation of this. And so we will see here that the year 1 REC price is indeed on average higher than the levelized REC price. Again, this is because of the nature of the structure, I should say, of the REC contracts that we expect to be executing. So we have assumed index REC contracts as the basis for our long-term contracting. And these REC contracts are assumed to be executed at a fixed nominal strike price. And what that means is that on an ongoing basis, the actual REC price paid will be equal to that fixed nominal strike price minus the reference prices of energy and capacity values. This may be a bit complex for some listeners, but for those who have been actively following the evolution of the index REC contracting structure, again, the general relationship will be that if energy and capacity prices, or as those prices change over time, the REC price will change as well. And so what this relationship generally shows with levelized REC prices being lower than Tier 1 REC prices is that we generally expect REC prices to fall through the contract life as a function of those energy and capacity values changing over time as well.
Thank you, Matt. We've got a question here on Tier 4, the energy baseline. It says, will the energy baseline be conducted at an external intertie level that connects with Zone J? More specifically, was the energy baseline assessed for each of the existing merchant transmission lines, including VFT, H2P, et cetera? The energy baseline is based on the supplier's historical energy deliveries into the New York control area, and it's not specific, not measured as specific intertie Relatedly, Tier 4 RECs will be measured and purchased at their injection point and delivery point in Zone J. I've got another question here on Tier 4 eligibility. Does the Tier 4 proposal allow for a Hydro-Quebec project in New York City? Is this considered a project already under construction? Resources, I'm sorry, I don't think I understand the question, but we do have specific requirements for hydropower within the within the white paper, and we have requirements that the project must already be under construction prior to the date of the orders. The hydropower, for instance, for Hydro-Quebec would be subject to the baselines that were proposed within the white paper. We've got a question here, Tom Rienzo, if you're available to respond to. What agency will be administering the accelerated transmission program?
Yeah, DPS has a proceeding open on that. You know, we have a proceeding open on the local and bulk transmission planning pursuant to the Renewable Energy Act. So I guess it would be DPS, it would be the agency.
Thank you, Tom. We've got another question here. Where can we find a copy of the white paper? The white paper is available not only on the DPS and DMM website, but also NYSERDA's website under the filings, orders, and reports site. But we will also make that link available.
Yeah, Corinne, I would just, for people looking on the DPS site, it is under case number 15E0302.
Thank you. There's a question here about whether or not there will be a published list of questions and answers, and we will not be publishing a list, but we will be providing a recording of the webinar. Let me see here. Hey, Matt, I've got a question here for you. Do the forecasted deadlines in land-based wind and PV costs include interconnection costs?
Thanks, Corinne. I'm not sure I fully understand the question because of the word deadlines that's included there, but generally I would say that yes, interconnection costs are included in the cost projections for land-based wind and solar PV. And so these costs are detailed quite explicitly within Appendix A of the white paper as well. So would encourage readers to review that material. But there has been, again, a detailed analysis performed to ensure that the assumed build costs for these technologies include not just panels and turbines, et cetera, but also the cost to have those resources connected to the New York State system. Thanks.
Thank you, and hang on, I've got one more here for you. Did the white paper calculations include the cost to ratepayers for conversions to gas, from gas to electric for heat stoves, hot water, and auto?
Sure, thanks. So the costs assessed within the white paper are for effectively the purchase of renewable energy credits only. So through, again, the given technology, whether it's on the Tier 1 or the offshore wind side. And so costs for initiatives that are outside of the electric sector effectively, such as those targeted for heat pumps, electric vehicles, efficiency, et cetera, are outside of the scope of this white paper specifically.
Thank you, Matt. Eric, Do the white paper calculations include the New York wind projects that are not a part of Tier 1 and have contracts outside of New York State?
Yes, so in response to that question, and I wonder whether, again, as a reminder, we might briefly pull up slide 19, please. And well, yes, thank you very much. And so the relevant entry to note here is the 2018 renewable generation figure. And so that figure includes all existing generation that counts towards our target, whether it's within Tier 2 or unsupported. And so for any further details on what's in that number, I would reference people to the 2018 CES progress report quoted on this slide.
Thank you. Sorry, here we've got a question on Tier 1 and Tier 4. Can you clarify the difference in types of hydropower that are eligible for Tier 1 and Tier 4 RECs? And can you clarify, if any, recommendations made on, well, actually, I'm sorry, these are two very different questions. Let me answer one. The differences between Tier 1 and Tier 4. Tier 1 is only for low-impact run-of-river facilities. Under Tier 4, all CLCPA eligible resources are allowed, subject to the conditions that were explained in the white paper, which includes both vintage for non-hydro, meaning that they have to be operational after the date of the order. For hydro resources, they will be subject to the two baseline conditions, the energy baseline and the GHG baseline that we've discussed here. Bear with me, folks. I'm just, as we're pulling in these questions live, just seeing what we've got on here. Looks like some of these questions are duplicates of others, so just bear with me as I sort of try to find a new question to respond here. All right, we might be getting to a point where we've largely answered a lot of the questions that we received. Oh, let me see, actually, we've got another one here. Okay. Well, I think, oh, sorry, let me see, here we've got another one here. Okay, Eric, you're on deck. How will legacy bioenergy be counted towards the 70 by 30 target?
Sure, and actually that's convenient. We still have slide 19 on the screen. So just to remind people that in our assessment of the 2018 renewable generation, we excluded bioenergy, and going forward, as we know, bioenergy under the CLCPA will also not be eligible to count towards the target. So effectively, the answer is yes, legacy bioenergy has been excluded from this assessment.
Thank you, Eric. Like I said, on implementation, we don't have specific answers on various implementation details because we are requesting for stakeholder feedback. So we won't be able to respond to those. I'll give folks another minute or so to take in. Maybe I got one for you, Eric. I'm going to go off it here. I think, Eric, it was seeking clarification. I'm not defining it, but it was seeking clarification on the adjustment to the LLC obligations and if 2020 was adjusted.
Yes, the answer is that the year 2020, no adjustment was made for 2020, so the target adjustment has been put forward in the white paper for 2021 and 2022.
All right. I think we're getting to the point where we're receiving duplicates of questions, but what we can certainly do is you can submit your questions, continue to submit to us your questions, and we can venture to answer them after this tech conference. And of course, we encourage you to submit your comments here through the proceeding. We've had quite a bit of slowdown on questions here. So with that, looks like we're just a few minutes early for the schedule here. So I will thank everyone for your participation today. As John and Doreen mentioned, this is quite a formative step and the next step to our to getting and achieving to our 70 by 30 goals and thereafter. So we do thank everyone for your participation, your pre-submitted questions, And apologies if we weren't able to get to all of them, but I think we've largely addressed the ones that we could here, and receiving a lot of duplicate questions. I also hope that you guys will refer back to the recorded webinar, and you can certainly share it with others. We will also post the slides to be available on the DPS website, as well as NYSERDA's website. And we thank everyone for your participation today. Thank you.